Well, let's head to Rwanda now. The Rwanda and India have signed three agreements to bolster bilateral relations. The agreements include an air service agreement, immigration, and an establishment of an entrepreneurship development center in the East African country.
It didn't make headlines, and that's why it mattered. While the world was watching loud power plays, India and Rwanda signed a deal that didn't challenge the United States directly, it simply worked around it. $15 billion flowed into factories, infrastructure, and systems that didn't need U.S. approval, U.S. financing, or U.S. frameworks. No confrontation needed, because influence doesn't disappear when you're attacked. It disappears when you're bypassed. And that's exactly what happened here. This deal didn't weaken America overnight. It did something more dangerous. It proved that global growth, partnerships, and power can move forward without Washington at the center. And once that idea takes hold, it doesn't reverse. The announcement did not arrive with fanfare. There were no dramatic speeches, no emergency summits, no headlines framed in alarm. Instead, it appeared as a sequence of trade filings, infrastructure agreements, logistics commitments, and long-term development frameworks quietly signed across ministries and state-owned entities. Yet, beneath the surface calm, the scale was unmistakable. India and Rwanda had agreed to a $15 billion partnership that stretched far beyond commerce, touching manufacturing, digital infrastructure, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, energy, and logistics. It was not designed to shock the world. It was designed to work. For Rwanda, the deal represented something it had pursued deliberately. For years, strategic relevance without dependency. The country had already positioned itself as a regional hub for services, logistics, and governance efficiency. What it lacked was scale capital tied to production rather than extraction. India arrived with exactly that, not short-term speculation, not conditional aid, but industrial investment structured for longevity. Factories were planned alongside training centers. Transport corridors were mapped with export routes already identified. Energy projects were synchronized with manufacturing demand. Nothing was symbolic. Everything was integrated. India approached the partnership with a different logic than traditional global players. Instead of prioritizing control, it prioritized interdependence. Supply chains were structured so that inputs flowed both ways. Rwanda gained manufacturing capacity and export leverage. India gained diversified production bases, reduced exposure to congested routes, and access to regional African markets without over-reliance on any single port or political bloc. This was influence without visibility. The United States did not oppose the deal. It barely reacted to it. That, in hindsight, was the first mistake, because while the agreement did not target Washington directly, its architecture quietly bypassed the mechanisms through which U.S. influence had traditionally flowed. Financial clearing systems were diversified, settlement structures reduced reliance on dollar-dominated pathways. Technology platforms favored interoperability over exclusivity. Procurement models emphasized regional sourcing instead of transcontinental dependency. None of this violated global norms. None of it required confrontation, yet each component slightly reduced the gravitational pull of US-centric systems. Rwanda benefited immediately. Employment expanded across multiple skill levels. Export capacity increased without sacrificing policy autonomy. Domestic firms were embedded into global value chains rather than serving as peripheral suppliers. The economy became more complex, not merely larger. India benefited strategically. By anchoring itself in Rwanda, it gained a stable base in the African continent without replicating the extractive patterns that had bred resistance elsewhere. Its firms learned to operate in multilingual, multi-regulatory environments. Its logistics networks grew more resilient. Its diplomatic footprint expanded through partnership rather than pressure. The shift was subtle but profound. For decades, U.S. global influence had rested on a combination of market access, financial dominance, security guarantees, and institutional leadership. The India-Rwanda deal did not challenge any of these pillars directly. It simply demonstrated that growth, alignment, and influence could occur without passing through them, that realization mattered more than the dollar amount. African policymakers watched closely, not because $15 billion was unprecedented, but because of how it was deployed. The deal did not demand political alignment. It did not impose governance templates. It did not extract concessions unrelated to development goals. It offered capacity in exchange for cooperation. Rwanda became a case study Other countries began asking different questions, not how do we attract U.S. attention, but how do we structure partnerships that reduce vulnerability? Not who will guarantee security, but who will build systems that function without guarantees. India did not present itself as an alternative hegemon. It presented itself as a participant. That distinction lowered resistance and increased trust. The United States, accustomed to visibility as a measure of power, underestimated the impact of quiet alignment. Influence was being redistributed not through dramatic realignments, but through incremental decisions made at the operational level: which standards to adopt, which software to deploy, which ports to expand, which training programs to fund. By the time patterns emerged, momentum had already set in. American firms began noticing competition where none had existed before. Bids were lost not on price alone, but on integration. U.S. proposals arrived as standalone projects. India-Rwanda proposals arrived as ecosystems. This was not about efficiency alone, it was about relevance. Rwanda's role evolved from recipient to node. It became a connector between East African markets, Indian manufacturing expertise, and global distribution channels. That positioning reduced the need for intermediaries historically dominated by Western firms. U.S. influence did not collapse. It diluted. The difference mattered. Dilution is harder to confront than opposition. There was no policy lever to pull, no sanction to impose, no alliance to mobilize. The shift occurred within the rules of the existing system, using its own mechanisms. India understood something the United States had long known but recently neglected: power does not always announce itself. Sometimes it embeds. As supply chains reconfigured, data flowed differently. Standards evolved quietly. Training curricula shifted. Regulatory familiarity grew between partners. Over time, these soft alignments hardened into structural realities. Rwanda did not exit any relationship. It expanded its options. That expansion was the threat, because influence weakens not when countries turn against you, but when they no longer need you. The India-Rwanda deal did not aim to undercut the United States. It simply made U.S. centrality less necessary, and in a global system built on assumptions of indispensability, that was enough. By the time analysts began connecting the dots, the deal was no longer news. It was infrastructure, it was employment, it was production. It was precedent, and precedents, once set, travel fast. The second phase of the shift unfolded quietly, almost invisibly, through systems rather than statements. Once the India-Rwanda partnership moved from planning into execution, its deeper implications became clearer. What had looked like a bilateral economic agreement began to function as a template, and templates, once proven, rarely stay contained. Industrial zones expanded around transport corridors linking Rwanda to neighboring countries. These zones were not isolated enclaves. They were designed to integrate local suppliers, regional logistics firms, and cross-border labor markets. Goods no longer moved outward in raw form and returned as finished products. Value stayed closer to its source. This altered bargaining power. Rwanda no longer negotiated trade terms as a narrow market. It negotiated as a production hub. That distinction changed how external partners approached it. Conversations shifted from aid and access to standards and scale. Influence followed function. India's role deepened without becoming dominant. Ownership structures were deliberately mixed. Technology transfer clauses were embedded early. Training programs emphasized local management rather than permanent foreign oversight. This prevented political backlash while ensuring operational continuity. For the United States, the implications were indirect but accumulating. American companies found that familiar entry points no longer guaranteed access. Procurement processes favored integrated supply chains over isolated bidders. Financial arrangements increasingly bypassed institutions where U.S. leverage had traditionally been strongest. Standards committees began reflecting broader participation. None of this was hostile. That was precisely the problem. There was no clear moment to respond to, no crisis to manage, no confrontation to frame. Influence was eroding through normal procedures. Every decision was defensible, every adjustment rational, yet the cumulative effect was unmistakable. Africa's internal dynamics also shifted. Rwanda's success strengthened arguments for South-South cooperation across the continent. Countries with similar development ambitions saw that partnership did not require subordination. India's approach contrasted sharply with older models associated with extraction, conditionality, or strategic pressure. Regional blocs began coordinating policies to attract similar deals. Infrastructure planning increasingly assumed continental integration rather than export dependency. Digital platforms adopted standards compatible with Asian and African systems rather than default Western frameworks. The United States remained engaged, but no longer central. This was not decline in absolute terms. American investment continued, trade persisted, diplomatic ties remained strong, but relative positioning changed. The United States was now one option among many, not the axis around which decisions revolved. India benefited from timing as much as strategy. Its own development experience allowed it to present solutions that felt adaptable rather than prescriptive. Its firms operated comfortably in environments where infrastructure was still evolving. Its financial institutions accepted longer horizons. This patience translated into trust. Rwanda capitalized on this alignment. Policy coherence increased, planning cycles extended, short-term volatility mattered less when long-term partnerships stabilized expectations. Domestic firms grew confident enough to invest alongside foreign capital rather than wait for it. This had political consequences without political messaging. As economic resilience improved, policy autonomy expanded. Rwanda gained room to maneuver diplomatically without fear of immediate economic retaliation. That autonomy reinforced sovereignty, which in turn attracted partners seeking stability. The United States observed these developments through fragmented lenses. Trade analysts saw competition. Diplomats saw diversification. Security planners saw neutrality. Rarely were these perspectives integrated into a single assessment. As a result, responses lacked cohesion. Meanwhile, the architecture solidified. Ports, data centers, power grids, and training institutes created physical and institutional sunk costs. Once built, they anchored relationships beyond any single administration or market cycle. This was influence embedded in concrete and code. Other African countries adapted the model selectively. Not every element transferred directly, but the principle endured. Partnership over patronage, production over extraction, systems over slogans. India did not replace the United States. It reduced dependency on it. That distinction again proved crucial. The global system did not flip. It redistributed. U.S. influence remained substantial in finance, technology, and security, but its ability to shape outcomes by default diminished. Engagement now required negotiation among peers rather than direction from the center. This recalibration unsettled long-held assumptions. For decades, global influence had been measured by presence and scale. The India-Rwanda deal suggested a different metric: integration. How deeply a country was woven into another's development process mattered more than how loudly it announced involvement. Rwanda emerged as a symbol of that shift, not because of size or wealth, but because of strategy. It demonstrated that small states could shape their position by choosing how and with whom they integrated. That lesson resonated far beyond its borders. The United States faced a choice: adapt to a world where influence is shared, contextual, and negotiated, or continue operating on assumptions of centrality that no longer held universally. The India-Rwanda partnership did not force that choice, but it clarified it. By the time the full impact became visible, the moment for easy adjustment had passed. Catch-up would require deeper engagement, longer timelines, and greater willingness to operate within systems not designed by Washington. That was the quiet undercutting, not removal, not rejection, but displacement through relevance. India and Rwanda did not announce a new order. They built one piece by piece within the existing framework. And as it took shape, it revealed a truth the United States could no longer ignore. Global influence in the modern era belongs not to those who dominate headlines, but to those who quietly design the pathways others begin to rely on.